Okay, well, welcome. My name is Mike Brownfield. I'm Communications Director at the Goldwater Institute. Thank you for joining us today for a special Goldwater Institute event, The Secret Strategy to Transform America. There's a disturbing trend happening in our country. Children are being taught radical racist politics. Public schools and universities are discriminating against students and staff on the basis of their race. And American history is being redefined before our eyes. And it's all happening under the guise of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So you're probably asking yourself, what's happening to our country? Today, we have with us two fantastic guests, Mike Gonzalez and Jonathan Butcher, who will help us answer this really important question. Mike Gonzalez is the Annales T. Arredondo e Pluribus Unum Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mike writes on identity politics, critical race theory, multiculturalism, assimilation, nationalism, and foreign policy in general. Mike spent close to 20 years as a journalist, 15 of them reporting from Europe. And he was also, he left journalism to join the administration of President George W. Bush, where he was speechwriter for the chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Before moving on to the State Department's European Bureau. Mike was also a member of President Trump's 1776 Commission, and he's the author of several books, including his new book, BLM, The Making of a New Marxist Revolution. Jonathan Butcher is the Will Skillman Fellow in Education at the Heritage Foundation. He's the author of Splintered, Critical Race Theory and the Progressive War on Truth. It'll be released next month. In 2021, South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster nominated Jonathan to serve on the board of the South Carolina Public Charter School District, a statewide charter school authorizer. He's researched and testified on education policy around the United States, and Jonathan is also a senior fellow at the Goldwater Institute. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. For our audience watching online, you'll have the opportunity to submit questions if you look at the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and I'll try to get to those questions throughout the day. But to open up, I'd like to ask both of our guests to tell us about their latest books and what they've uncovered. And I'll turn to you first, Mike Gonzalez, and your fascinating new book, BLM, The Making of a New Marxist Revolution.
Thanks, Mike. I want to thank all of you at Goldwater for inviting me to speak. I actually met the great senator myself about several decades ago when I was an intern in the Senate, and he was overweight with books, and I asked him if I could help him carry his books, and he took me up on my offer. But I particularly love the Institute's motto, in defense of liberty. I mean it very seriously, that I like to think that I have devoted my life, my career, to the defense of liberty. And that's the reason I fight BLM. That's the reason I wrote a book about the BLM organizations. You know, on June 27th, 2019, speaking to liberals in Maine, Alicia Garza, who's one of the main founders of BLM, said the following, quote, "I believe we all have work to do to keep dismantling the organizing principle of this society," unquote. And that is exactly what BLM is on its way to accomplishing. Even today, as evidence mounts of financial malfeasance on the part of the main organization of BLM, the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, they're on their way to transforming America. And the only reason why the strategy remains a secret, the title of our event is A Secret Strategy to Transform America. The only reason the strategy remains a secret is because the media refuses to report on what they want to do. The blackout left by the media, by the left media, is why I wrote my book, BLM, The Making of a New Marxist Revolution. The BLM organizations have made our country much less free since they started their mayhem in 2013, and especially since 2020, when they really terrorized our cities with over 630 riots and over 12,000 demonstrations, which at times could become very intimidating. What are they doing? Well, children are being indoctrinated into racist practices and tenets of critical race theory. And this is a form of child abuse. When you tell a Black child or a Mexican-American child that he or she should not like numeracy or literacy, should not like being on time, punctuality, that these things are white practices, that is a form of child abuse. And when you tell a white child that she benefits, a young little white child that she benefits from unearned privilege and she should be less ambitious and raise her hand less, that is also a form of child abuse. These things are not just false. They're ugly and racist. And I think my colleague and co-writer Jonathan is going to talk more about this. And they're happening because of the BLM disturbances. And definitely since they took over and really terrorized our cities, causing billions in damage, by the way. It was the costliest period of disturbance in US history, as according to the US information at the Insurance Institute. These indoctrinations of our children also violate existing law. They violate various provisions of the Constitution and the Civil Rights Act. And it's not just children. Adults are being forced at their office to go through re-education sessions. They're forced to believe, they're forced to affirm that America is systemically racist out of fear of losing their jobs. A majority of Americans are now telling pollsters that they are afraid to speak their mind. And this is happening in the land of the free. The CRT, as we know, has also exploded in the military, houses of worship, the corporate boardroom, even the sports leagues. There's no escape. And again, all of it because of BLM. And something that people talk about less, thousands of people are being killed because of BLM. Many studies, including 2 recent ones, confirm the existence of something called the Ferguson effect. That's when police pull back, take fewer proactive actions in cities and places where BLM has demonstrated or rioted. So the 30% spike in homicides in the United States, the greatest by far in our history, should be no mystery. That was in 2020, and in 2021, they have added many cities have actually added to that murder rate, and it has to be said as well that most of the Americans being killed are Black Americans. I'm going to give you some figures now. In Milwaukee, in 2021, there were 178 murdered Black Americans and eight white. In Chicago, that figure was 638 Black Americans and 30 whites. In St. Louis, the ratio was 178 to 11. Don't these Black lives matter? What I want these audiences to understand is that these things are not just simply a byproduct of what BLM did. No, our lives have deteriorated in all these ways by design. The organizing principles of society are being dismantled before our eyes. This is the not so secret strategy to transform America. BLM, for example, to this day, you go on their website, calls not just for defunding the police, but for eliminating the prison and courts. Now, no society can survive that. And they know it because they want to dismantle society. And they have told us so. The recent re-education sessions in our schools, as you said, actually spent more time in Asia than Europe. I spent about 10 years in Asia. And I studied the Maoist struggle sessions of the Cultural Revolution. And the reason that what we see today resemble that is because they're branches of the same tree. Our media doesn't want to tell us about how the founders and leaders of the BLM GNF undertook ideological training for many years and also learned how to recruit individuals and what the left calls organizing. So I decided to tell the story myself. The media, for example, never tells you that BLM founder Patrice Cullors and Alicia Garza were trained in centers set up by people like Eric Mann and Harmony Goldberg. Mann is a former member of the Weather on the Ground, a Maoist, and the Weather on the Ground, by the way, for the young in the audience, is a group in the 60s and 70s which was designated as a terrorist group by the FBI. And he's a Soviet apologist. Goldberg is not just a Marxist, but a follower of Antonio Gramsci, who precisely taught that before the revolution, we needed to have cultural indoctrination. So this is what we're seeing. People have told me, look, Mike, the young don't know what Marxism is. They don't have any negative associations with it. So what I think is we should be our job to tell people what Marxism is. Let me just end by quoting Marx in the manifesto. He said in the manifesto and elsewhere that the revolution had to be bloody. The revolution had to be violent. And that after that, the government was going to take people's property away. And in order to do that, because people were going to resent that, the government was going to have to be despotic. That is his word. He said there was despotism was going to be needed. But Marx didn't tell you other things. That communism can take away your soul, will take away your soul. That communism will take away your smile. That communism will take away your joy. And in the end, what you have is cities and countries littered with party apparatchiks or informants or cynics, where the only humor is black humor. It's the only way to that people see their way out. I will end there, but again, I want to drive home the point that this is all what BLM wants. They say this. They call themselves Marxists. They say they're trained by Marxists. The media doesn't tell you because the media does not cover them. It covers for them. Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you again to the Goldwater Institute.
Thanks, Mike. Jonathan Butcher, your new book, Splintered Critical Race Theory and the Progressive War on Truth, looks at how this same sort of philosophy is expanding in our schools. Can you talk to us about what you uncovered in your writing?
Sure, and thank you, Mike, and thank you to the Goldwater Institute. It's always a pleasure to be partnered with an institute that takes seriously the mission of freedom-loving institutes, and that is to set the agenda. We set the agenda for lawmakers because we are trying to protect liberty. We're trying to spread freedom. So I'm so pleased to be a part of the work that you're doing. Yeah, so let me start by telling you a story. Scarlett Johnson describes her Wisconsin town in the McQuan-Thiensville School District as, quote, quiet, friendly, nice. But in a story that's going to sound familiar to parents around the country, over the past year, she began noticing not so friendly material that some of her children, high school age, were bringing home, and that she saw on Zoom during the online school that was required by students during the COVID-19 pandemic. As she told me in an interview, quote, everything is being viewed through the lens of race, everything. There is division now among parents in her community on this issue, and she says it's so divisive and so unnecessary. Much of the material, Scarlett said, was focused on making kids social justice warriors. It wasn't about just reading and math anymore. Scarlett explained to me that she does not want to ignore the difficult discussions about race and discrimination. She said to me, I just wanted them to have a liberal education truly in the sense of the word, she said. Yet educators from her children's school district they were taken in by the equity training programs where presenters pushed the idea that they were either oppressed or oppressors, depending on the color of their skin, complete with recommendations that educators rely on staples from the critical race theory canon, such as Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire and White Fragility, which is a modern day version of why individuals should consider themselves to be oppressors based on their ethnicity. Scarlett said this to me, and I thought it was pretty powerful. She said, I don't want my child who is brown to see themselves as a victim. I don't want my child who is white to see my other child as an oppressor. This is completely wrong. They are individuals, and their character and their decisions make up who they are, not who their ancestors were. Scarlett adds, it's exhausting and frustrating. I just hadn't realized how far things had come. In the writing of my book, I came across parent one after another who told me a similar story. They thought everything was okay. They thought they knew what was being taught in their child's classroom. And then they told me the story of how they learned of what was actually going on. And it's not just history. It was in math too, and English. I talk in my book about something called the hashtag disrupt texts movement, which is an effort by those on the radical left to censor what's being taught. There are a lot of accusations out there today in the mainstream media saying that conservatives are trying to ban books and that there's a movement now to somehow censor what's being taught in class. But you have to recognize that this disrupt text movement, which is being promoted across the web, is in fact saying that you shouldn't teach To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird is squarely in their sights. The same, of course, goes for Shakespeare, Othello, never mind, right? Or the ideas from Homer, and on and on. Remember, parents want schools to deal with hard questions. Parents want educators and students to wrestle with the issues of race and virtue and freedom. We cannot, nor should we, avoid these things. In a survey that we conducted at the Heritage Foundation, 59% of parents said that they want educators to teach students, quote, that the birth of the nation is 1776 and the year the colonists declared independence, not 1619. And get this one, 70% of respondents to that survey, a nationally representative survey of parents, 70% said that teachers should tell students that, quote, slavery was a tragedy that harmed the nation, but our freedom and prosperity represent who we are as a nation, offering a beacon to those wanting to immigrate here. There is no sentiment out there saying that we should stop teaching the failures in the past to live up to our ideals. That's not what parents are saying, despite what is being claimed in the media that there's an effort to censor the discussion of America's past. Another poll is worth mentioning because I think this gets to the heart of what my book is trying to convey. There's a divide today over America's most closely held beliefs. Between 2016 and 2021, the share of respondents to this particular nationally representative poll said that, quote, Americans are united and in agreement about the most important values. So that statement that we are united, it fell from 19% to 11%. And it said that Americans are greatly divided when it comes to the most important values. But take a step back for just a moment, because you have to look at the other questions in that poll. Despite that figure, which sounds a little discouraging, 88% of respondents, 88% said that a fair judicial system and the rule of law are important to the US identity as a nation. So remember that as Mike was talking about what the BLM movement is trying to advocate for. 85% said that individual liberties and freedoms as defined by the Constitution are important to our national identity. 85% agreed on that. 80% said that a democratically elected government is important. So there really isn't that much of a divide. Some of these core ideas really are central to America's identity and what we believe as a nation. So in my book, I introduce some of the critical content that's found in K-12 schools that certainly has Marxist origins and the origins in critical theory dating back to the Frankfurt School, which Mike touched on, that eventually evolved and became the critical legal theory movement that then produced the critical race theory movement that's in the news today. Once the Frankfurt School came to America, their ideas spread, especially in higher education, but it wasn't long before they affected the teachers in K-12 schools today. Pedagogy of the Oppressed, for example, is still one of the most assigned books in colleges of education. I also talk about the what's going on in college campuses around the US. And when I was at the Goldwater Institute and working on free speech on campus, we knew that this concept of free speech was so important, so vital to the academic space. And we wrote about ways to protect the ability of anyone to speak, to listen and be heard on college campuses. But as you scratch away sort of the surface here, you recognize that what is behind the shoutdowns, what is behind these very sometimes violent activities on campus is a demand from students in the realm of racial identity. All of these different things, all of these different protests that Mike was talking about, students are being taught these ideas, it's being fed to them, and then they are regurgitating it on campus and they are acting and living it out. And that is really what critical race theorists want. In fact, some of the founders of critical race theory say that critical race theory has an activist dimension. So let me just close with 3 ideas that my book talks about that give us a shared sense of America's identity on which we can build and look into the future with some optimism and some hope. Okay, so 3 things. So let's start first. Too many Americans failed to live up to the national creed in the past, but this fact does not represent a shortcoming of the creed itself, right? It doesn't represent that the ideas of freedom and opportunity and prosperity and the Declaration of Independence, it's not a failure on the ideas part, it's a failure on the individuals who are trying to carry it out. So that's the first, is that these ideas can help us to overcome the divisive ideas that critical race theory is injecting today. Second, the success of Black Americans in the past in building a culture and participating in the economy, even under the terrible conditions that slavery and Jim Crow laws caused, are extraordinary. We, all of us, should celebrate these accomplishments and teach the attitudes and behaviors that made these successes possible. These achievements are a part of the American story. They're a part of America's shared experience. This in no way minimizes the injustices that were done. Rather, it elevates the conversation about the successes that were accomplished in the past. Third, our society will be defined by our cultural disposition on how we treat those with whom we disagree. We can't get away from that. One of the most lasting and time-tested beliefs is that we should love our enemies. This attitude combines the virtues of love, kindness, gratitude, humility, on which the founders based our constitutional republic. Critical race theory stands in stark contrast to loving your neighbor, never mind loving your enemy, and it's rooted in conflict and resistance and a perpetual search both for enemies and victimhood. No nation can long survive when adults teach these ideas to the next generation. So with that, I'm happy to talk more about what's in my book and what's in Mike's.
Well, thanks so much, Jonathan. Reminder to everybody, you can ask questions of our panelists using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll try to get to those throughout. Mike, turning back to you, I want to go to this idea of, so most folks in America have seen Black Lives Matter as a slogan, and they'll see it on a yard sign, on a t-shirt. You mentioned, of course, at sporting events, we may see it, at the Super Bowl, but there's much more, and it's a slogan that understandably people can rally behind. But it's much more than a slogan. And you write so much in your book about the roots of it and the policy goals. And I think it's important to understand that and how it connects to critical race theory. So can you talk about what the folks that are truly behind the movement are advocating for, and how is that truly not understood or not connected to what maybe as consumers people are seeing when they're seeing these slogans on social media?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think with BLM, it is useful to break it down into three components. So the first one is the concept that Black Lives Matter. And I think that's a beautiful concept. I don't say all lives matter. I think it's important to affirm that Black Lives Matter because of a history that we all know so well that I don't even have to explain it here. Then there's the movement, and that's a separate thing. And the movement is the people who marched, the people who pitched signs on their lawns, and they did these things for a variety of reasons. Some of them were just virtue signaling. Others had their righteous feelings manipulated by whom? By the third component, the organizations and their founders and leaders. And that is really what I write about. The media only talks and only looks at the movement and at the concept. But if you go to Google and you Google Black Lives Matter, it doesn't take you to a beautiful concept. It doesn't take you to a sign on a lawn. It takes you to the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation. It is a thing with $60 million in the bank, we think, I'm going to get into that in a minute, with bills in Congress, with a foreign policy. It's an organization that endorses and opposes candidates. It is an organization that has incredible cultural cachet, that teams up with the musical Hamilton, and that plays a very negative influence in our lives. Now, the reports last week, and I have to mention the Washington Examiner, because the Washington Examiner did fantastic, groundbreaking work here. They discovered that BLM GNF has been without a leader since May, when Patrisse Cullors stepped down. She stepped down amid reporting that she had spent millions of dollars buying mansions, and in that it has to be transparent because it has a tax exempt status called the 501c3 status. And when you do that, you owe it to society, you owe it in the law to put out a 990, which is a form, and they haven't done so. They haven't explained what they have done with the $92 million that they themselves admit they raised in 2020. One more thing, and I just leave it at this. So investigations are required here, and the state of California has suspended BLM GNF's tax exempt status and has told BLM GNF it cannot raise funds until it says what it has done with its money. BLM GNF said in 2020 it raised $90 million. It also said that it has sent out 127 million emails. 127 million emails just in half a year. and that I believe it was 1.5 million actions were taken as a result of these emails. We had 630 riots as coded by the U.S. Crisis Monitor housed in Princeton. We need to investigate this because this is billions of dollars in damage. So you separate that from the concept, which is unimpeachable, and from the movement, which is amorphous and it's hard to grapple with.
Jonathan, last week across the country, many schools celebrated Black Lives Matter Week of Action. And this is a way, it's one of these ways where you're seeing, okay, this new movement like materializing and throughout K-12. So what are some of the things that are taught to schools, and how does that intersect with critical race theory, and like what was that Week of Action about?
So that's a great question. And you used a good term there, intersection, because there's several things that connect here when you look at the Black Lives Matter Week of Action, because you have the Black Lives Matter organization, which Mike is talking about here. You have the support of teacher unions, which endorse the Black Lives Matter Week of Action. In fact, the New York City's largest teacher union endorsed it. You have then this litany of principles that they post on their website saying that this is what they believe and what they want to achieve. It overlaps greatly with radical positions on a number of different issues. It's not just race. It has to do with the teaching of sex education to very young children at inappropriate ages. You have this idea of dissolving the nuclear family. So remember, not just teaching that there are different kinds of families, not just saying, right, that families can come in different forms. They want to critique, they want to criticize the nuclear families specifically, right? They set that as a target. And that is, I think, a feature of critical race theory. It's not a bug, right? It is a feature that what they are trying to do is to identify those things that are part of traditional values and say that those traditional values are a part of a system that is systemically oppressive. That's another one of those terms that are thrown around a lot today, that America is systemically racist or systemically oppressive. And they argue that there are pieces in culture, traditional culture, that they want to dismantle or take apart. That's why it is called critical theory, right? When you had traditional theory 100 years ago or more than that, this was the idea that came from the Enlightenment, that came from talking about reason and our ability to use science to advance, humanity, and eventually, right, leads to the concepts of human flourishing. Critical theory, and now critical race theory, has added to that, and it is saying, no, instead, what we have to do is not just critique, but as Mike was saying, try to disassemble the parts of society that we rested the American experiment on, right? The rule of law, the Constitution, representative government, all of those different things. That's what's funneled through the Black Lives Matter Week of Action, right? It's not just a conversation about America's past. It's not just a conversation about slavery and history. When you look at the books and the list of recommended items that the BLM Week of Action recommends, things like Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, right? That is anything but a flattering retelling of American history. And for those who have heard of it before but may not know much about it, remember that this book, The People's History, has no footnotes. It has been debunked by any number of scholars, including individuals who wrote book reviews for teacher unions, right? Even those on the left have been skeptical of what this is doing. And that is notable because teacher unions, Black Lives Matter Week of Action, and the Howard Zinn Foundation, the Zinn Foundation, all have worked together to protest any sort of resistance or rejection of this widespread racial discrimination that we see today. They had one just in Texas last summer. So it is, just like you said, there's an intersection here, right? There's a vision that the radical left has for, as the title of this event says, that they are trying to reshape, they are trying to change the way that the United States thinks of the American dream.
Yeah, Jonathan is exactly on point here. Critical theory, one of its main gists is that from the 30s by German neo-communists, that everything in society, that there was a conceptual superstructure that actually made reality, that we may be able to apprehend reality through our senses. We can only comprehend it through the conceptual superstructure of society. So everything, man is being oppressed, he just doesn't know it. And it is the job of critical theorists to introduce man to their oppression. Marcuse, one of the great critical theorists, said that liberation will only come with the consciousness of servitude. And critical race theory says that this conceptual superstructure is white supremacy. When you hear white supremacy, most normal Americans will think of ugly people who believe that whites are superior to blacks, but they say no. You know, it's not that. It's everything. As Richo Delgado said, it is in the ordinary business of society. That's why it's totalizing. The ordinary business of society has to be destroyed. Everything has to be replaced. When Alicia Garza, whose every move is informed by all of this, when she says we need to dismantle the organizing principle of society, again, that is a quote. Let that sink in. She means that. She doesn't mean social justice. The New York Magazine, actually, Brave, he made some mistakes, but Brave reported just this week reported on the financial malfeasance, and he quoted a bunch of people saying, yeah, they've done nothing for Black Americans. They have done, we don't see any money. And the bad thing the journalist does is that he doesn't mention the Marxism. And without the Marxism, you don't really understand why. Because social justice is just a facade for wanting to change the country. They were trained by people who want to change the country. Everybody listening to this have to understand this.
So a question for you guys, picking up on that notion of sort of changing the framework of the way we view America. On the first part of that question, this is to you, Jonathan. This is materializing in the 1619 project, which is being taught in schools, right? So I'd like you to, if you could tell us about what that is. And then to Mike, why is the 1619 project's goal like a necessary precursor to the ends that BLM is trying to achieve?
Thanks, Mike, and that's a good question. And it's important at this point to recognize the big picture that's happening in the discussion on social media and in the news about what's really going on here. The issue at the core of this is racial discrimination, and that those who advocate for critical race theory believe that racial discrimination is appropriate. Make no mistake, Ibram X. Kendi, right, who wrote How to Be an Anti-Racist, he said, his famous quote, right, is that we need present discrimination to counter past discrimination. We need discrimination in the future. So discrimination is appropriate, right? Which of course runs counter to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, to the cultural, I think, understanding that Americans have that discrimination is awful. It's terrible. It is what we've tried to grow out of. It's what we've tried to move away from. The 1619 Project perpetuates this concept by saying, as you know, we were talking about a moment ago, that our founding ideals were false when they were written, right? The accusations need to be lobbed at the creation of our founding documents. It needs to be criticized what America was based on, because the concepts themselves were at fault. And then, you know, as we, you know, look at the world only through the 1619 set of glasses here, where everything has to be seen through the lens of racial discrimination, we begin to recognize that they actually got some very important things wrong. Right? They argued that the American Revolution was a effort to keep slavery in the United States, which is not true. And in fact, reviewers of the 1619 Project famously wrote to the editors and then wrote on their own in Politico magazine to say that they told the 1619 Project editors that that was not right. The same goes for the significance of when slaves arrived in the New World, because actually slaves came to the New World well before 1619 in Florida. And so you have this sort of retelling of America's past to shape the agenda that they are trying to push, right? They're trying to shape a set of messages that makes it appear as though America's past isn't what we've all been taught when we were in school. And look, that it's, as I say in my book, it is not fair to drape superhero capes on our founding fathers and call the issue settled and walk away. But it's also not fair to turn the entire thing upside down and say that the whole system and the whole way that we consider the American dream is something that is riddled with error and not even worth preserving.
Yeah, so Mike, to you, this totally different view of our culture and what our Constitution stands for is changing that is critical to this movement. Why?
Well, first, let me just add one smidgen thing to what Jonathan said. Slavery doesn't really arrive with the Spaniards in Florida in 1560s. It really was already here. The Aztecs were famous for having a huge slave system. So slavery was in the New World already, practiced for centuries before the European arrives. So 1619, why it's so important? Sorry, I have to take you back to the 1920s again. Antonio Gramsci, the founder of Italy's Communist Party, very similar to the Frankfurt School that Jonathan has been talking about. And his main idea is the theory of cultural hegemony. The worker is not rebelling because the worker has accepted the cultural habits of his bourgeois oppressor. The worker likes God. He's loyal to God. The worker likes his family, likes his wife, likes his children. The worker likes his nation. He's patriotic, and the worker likes very much his private property. These are all things that Marx said had to go away, had to be destroyed, had to be abolished. So Gramsci says that Marx is right on everything except not in his tactics. There was a hegemonic narrative that the worker had false consciousness, and you need to take that away and replace it with a counter narrative, a revolutionary narrative. And that is exactly what 1619 Project does in its most essential level. The 1619 Project changes our origin story. You can't get any fundamental than that to change this. No, the origin is not 1776. The origin is 1619, when we don't know whether they were indentured laborers or slaves. Either way, really ugly tragedy. They arrived from Angola in 1619 and said that is our origin story. So it changes our origin story. And once I was said something to the founder, the architect of the 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones, about Alicia Garza on Twitter, and she came back to me. She goes, "What does Alicia Garza have to do with the 1619 Project?" Aside from the fact that they have panels together, I said, "You're both trying to create a new narrative. You're both trying to dismantle the existing narrative and replace it with an alternative narrative. That's what you both have in common." And then she left me alone after that.
Well, and to sort of like cut away at the core of our country, if our founding we were rotten to our core, then this is what, correct me if I'm wrong, this is what's justifying the call to defund police, to eliminate prisons, to like just break down, like eradicate capitalism as a system, because this is all founded on this flawed racist premise. Is that a correct telling?
So Garza says when she meets with other communists, she did in 2015 with Left Roots, she said that in order to say you cannot, that Black lives cannot matter under capitalism, that capitalism is racist. What they say is that capitalism rewards the wrong criteria. It rewards hard work, it rewards punctuality, it rewards, Richard Delgado is big on this in his primer on critical race theory. It rewards not postponing till tomorrow what you can do today. And these are all things that are very bad for society. That's why all of them, starting with the critical theorists and Marx, believe that we're oppressed. Marx believes that to work for somebody else is wage slavery. This is a story about Frederick Douglass sharing a stage in 1848 with a communist, and the communists talked about wage slavery, and Frederick Douglass got really, really angry and said, "No, that's what we want. We're not being paid right now. We're being made to work for free. We want to be liberated so we can get paid." He understood, because of his lived experience, how silly it was to talk about wage slavery. So yes, they hate capitalism. They hate individual private property. They believe that this leads inexorably to wage slavery. And all of this, all of it has to be dismantled, has to be replaced. And let me tell you that every communism and Marxism are perfect in only one way. Every society that has tried this has ended very, very badly. And for us to shut our eyes to this, not to avert our eyes because race is a difficult issue to discuss, it's a very, very big mistake.
Remind everybody, you can ask a question of our panelists if you use the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom window, and I'll turn to one of those questions right now. To Jonathan, what would your elevator pitch be to the comment that CRT is not being taught, or that the right is just trying to censor talk of racism? And I would add to that question, can you give us some just real, like, simple examples of how this is like turning up in like a fourth grader's book bag?
Sure, that's a great question because it's said all the time in the media that critical race theory is not taught in schools. If so, then why in Hayward Unified School District, right across the bay from San Francisco, did they release a memo on their website to the entire school community that promised they would keep the words critical race theory in the school curriculum? Why in California, in their ethnic studies program, do they have an entire chapter called intersectionality, which is the component of critical race theory added by Kimberly Crenshaw? Why did the Portland public school system have a critical race theory working group that posts their videos on YouTube with the heading critical race theory working group? And on and on. Loudoun County in Virginia hired a teacher training program that used the words critical race theory in the training. You can find the words, and you can find them in my book. So they're there. So I encourage you to buy my book because there's more in there. But you don't have to use the words, right? You don't have to use the words critical race theory. It's often called culturally relevant learning. It's called white privilege studies. The Iowa City Public School District has a whole page devoted to white privilege studies. The Southern Poverty Law Center, the radical group that has, they created something called Learning for Justice, which produces a ton of material to teach critical race theory. They also have a whole section devoted to white privilege studies and oppressive studies and on and on. So, in fact, I would say, Washington, D.C. has their public school system has a whole page devoted to culturally relevant learning, which has these concepts in it. I just close with this. Note the power here that critical race theory can be found in any subject, right? California has erased its math standards that it created under the Common Core and is replacing it with a set of standards based on critical race theory in math. It's about white privilege and it's about oppression. There was I told you about disrupt texts earlier. You have in science, there's a National Association of Science Teachers that had a session in 2019 about creating affinity spaces for science teachers. Affinity groups, of course, are when you divide people based on the color of their skin. Mandatory affinity groups are now being used in K-12 schools. And I'll close with this. Just this week, our good friends at Parents Defending Education had filed a lawsuit against a school district up in Massachusetts because they had a mandatory affinity group and the district folded and they actually settled. They had created a settlement with PDE because they knew that critical race theory's application will not stand in court. They know it. The educators that are doing this, they're doing it for as long as they can get away with it. But they know that once it gets in court and it's very clear that we are talking about the application of racial discrimination, it will not stand.
And Montgomery County, Maryland, next door to where I am right now, is now introducing a new curriculum that will make social studies strengthen students' sense of racial, ethnic, and tribal identities. They are literally trying to divide us.
Mike, there's a great question here. I'm excited to ask you because I know we're going to have an awesome and animated response. Has there been any effort to contact editorial boards of major papers or executives of television news networks to explain why we're not getting complete reporting on this, why the other side is just non-existent?
No, and we're not going to get anything. Columbia Journalism School, the Citadel, the Cathedral of Journalism, in 2020 sent out an email cheering the fact that newspapers were abandoning the shibboleth, Columbia's words, of objectivity. newspapers have abandoned objectivity, and they're being the ones that want to maintain their objectivity are being told by leftists and in the newsroom that they're putting people of color's lives at stake. They are risking their lives of people. Of course, this is a nonsense. However, this is what they're having to face, and people have been fired. The guy who ran an op-ed by Senator Cotton was fired. I believe that was the New York Times or the Philadelphia Inquirer. I forget now. Just for running an op-ed by a sitting U.S. senator with which like 60% of the country agreed. I forget what the subject was. So I don't think journalists have really thrown their lot with BLM GNF. They say this is, if you Google the term year of racial reckoning, you get hundreds of hits. And they have led the way. A guy who's doing his thesis at the University of Georgia Tech did a study which showed that in 2013, i.e. the year that BLM begins, is when the New York Times and the Washington Post began to use all these terms: white supremacy, white privilege, systemic racism, structural racism. If you see the graph, it goes like this right after 2013. So it's not that they have embraced it, it's that they have led the way, our major newspapers. There really isn't, and big tech is enthralled to all of this as well. And by the way, that again, to use the expression Jonathan used, is a feature, not a bug. Herbert Marcuse, the most famous critical theorist, had an essay in the 1960s calling for repressive tolerance. Repressive tolerance said that tolerance from that point on would have to be shown only to the left, that conservatives we could not be tolerant of conservative views. We're seeing that today, wherever he is, not in heaven, I'm sure, Herbert Marcuse is definitely smiling.
Mike, there's a quick question for you. One of our viewers is familiar with BLM. What is BLM GNF?
Global Network Foundation. It is if you Google Black Lives Matter, it takes you directly there. It is blacklivesmatter.org. The Global Network Foundation is the organization with the $60 million, is the organization that sent out all the emails in 2020 that was at the heart of the organizing. Is the organization, the leaders of these organizations, the former leaders, because now it's leaderless, were the ones who went to Ferguson in 2014 after the police shooting of Michael Brown and organized all these communist and socialist groups that descended into Ferguson and organized the things that we're seeing today in full flower. So it's Global Network Foundation, Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation.
And Mike, your book does such a fantastic job of, it's not just, BLM is not just a creation of the last couple of years. You're connecting to the radical movements of the 60s and before to show that this is a thread and a strategy and a concept that really goes back.
Right. The new left, which is the splintered from the old left in the 1960s, is a creation, I think Jonathan mentioned this, of critical legal studies. We have the Weathermen and all that. What they said was the American worker is conservative. The American worker is a wonderful quote that I'm using in a paper that I'm writing that I think happened at Berkeley. Somebody was addressing and said the worker has turned rightward. The worker will now lead the revolution. So the two groups that were identified, one by Marcuse, he talked about the ghetto population. His words, he said, is that people of other colors and other races that are going to lead the revolt. They're not revolutionary. We white Marxist intellectuals have to ideologically instruct them. And then the students. And it is this component, the students, who are now taking over the academy, who are everywhere, who have taken over a lot of our cultural institutions. And it is these former students, these radicals from the 60s, that are now calling the shots in many places that are of cultural value.
There's a hunger in our questions, I can tell, wanting to know, well, what can we do about this? And Jonathan, I'd like to start with you from the K-12 education standpoint. What is being done? What can be done?
Now, that's a great question, because there is hope, and I think there are solutions. And so I've been so pleased to partner with Goldwater for one of the solutions that Matt Beinberg has talked about for a couple of years now, which is that you should allow parents and taxpayers in general to see what is being taught in classrooms. And parents should be able to learn what their children are being exposed to before they see it splashed across a headline. A quick story for you. So a couple of years ago, a teacher in Texas showed his 8th grade class a graphic, a comic strip that equated the KKK with modern day police officers. And eventually that made the news. Eventually it got all its way up to the governor's office, and the governor came out and said, this teacher should be fired, right? Why should a parent have to wait to that point to realize what's being taught in their child's classroom? So that kind of transparency is essential. I would say, secondly, and this is a model that the Goldwater Institute has on our website, but we need to re-emphasize that racial discrimination is inappropriate and give state lawmakers the tools to deal with it. Our model goes like this. It says that no individual should be compelled to affirm, profess, believe any idea that violates the Civil Rights Act of 1964, including some of the things that we've talked about here, that individuals should receive benefits or punishments based on the color of their skin, or that one race or ethnicity is better than another, or that you are by nature oppressive based on the color of your skin. We can set a core of a state proposal around that idea and build transparency on top of that. And the two go very well together. And we can do that and also say, and proposals that are out there today, such as in Georgia, for example, they say that this proposal is not meant to limit what is discussed in the classroom. It's not meant to censor ideas out of what is discussed between teachers and students. But remember that critical race theory has an activist dimension. It is meant to be applied. It is meant to be put into use. It's not just an idea. It's effectively a verb, right? This idea that discrimination should be practiced today. So we can block that. We can stop it by reaffirming the nature of the Civil Rights Act, by saying that compelled speech of any type should be prohibited.
Mike, I read I think this was an anecdote in your book where you reported, or you wrote a piece in the New York Post where you called out one of the BLM calls to action, and it was about, they said that they want to disrupt the Western prescribed family structure, but then after that, that notion was scrubbed from the BLM website. And I think this kind of goes to, once some of these things are being exposed to sunlight as to what they truly stand for, there's change, and there's been a change in public opinion. Can you talk more about that and how we've sort of seen this like morphing of what the movement says they are, and what does that say about, well, what can we do to really like reclaim the America that we know?
Yeah, so I read Marxists so much that I have adopted their ways. So I limit myself to just exposing what they do. I'm the guy with the howitzer trying to say this is what they do. So I do what they do. Jonathan and I have a division of labor. He's the one that gives the content after I come in and say that, well, this is what the Marxists want to do. They want to destroy your life. You're quite right. After I wrote that with my colleague Angie Olivastro, about 1 million people read it on the Heritage website alone, and BLM GNF removed the whole page from the website. The chapter in Los Angeles, if you go to it today, so that was one of its 13 principles. The chapter in Los Angeles only has 12 principles now. They got rid of disrupting the family. However, BLM at School Action Week, if you go to their website, they still have 13 principles. They forgot to get rid of disrupting the family when they talk to kids. But again, this is elemental. This comes from the manifesto. In the manifesto, Marx says, abolish the family. The family is one of these civil society institutions, is the key civil society institutions that stands in the way of revolution, that stands in the way of ideology, that stands in the way of, and we're seeing this today with liberals who have really taken leave of their senses, are saying, no, the parents should have no say over education. I've never seen liberals say stupid stuff. They used to say evil stuff, But now they've gone stupid. They're saying, stuff that is political malpractice, because this is key. This is key. They take your child away and we indoctrinate them. And so the family is a very important part of civil society that must be abolished. BLM firmly believes that, and every Marxist that has come between 1848 to today's BLM has again also said that family must be abolished.
Jonathan, I'll give you a final, go ahead.
Well, I would just very quickly, I just wanted to add, note the places where there has been a backing off of what the hardcore positions of critical race theory are, right? There's the Smithsonian Institution that had that graphic that talked about how hard work was an example of whiteness. That was pulled down. You have the public school district that I was just talking about. You have the things that Mike was saying about Black Lives Matter and their different principles. I mean, on and on. Once these things are exposed and they recognize that Americans don't like these ideas, they don't like the idea that discrimination should still be practiced. That's why this whole movement here is being driven by radical activists. It's not being driven by grassroots, right? The average parent wants their child to go to school, make friends, be successful, and then become a happy neighbor and successful for the rest of their lives, right? To pursue human flourishing. This is not something that is coming from the ground up. It's being pushed by the top down.
This has been a fantastic conversation. We just have a few minutes left. With that time, Mike, where can people find your book, BLM, The Making of a New Marxist Revolution?
Go to Amazon. It's selling well there. Amazon tried to censor the ads for it, and then they apologized and they stopped doing it. And they said it was human error, and they gave me quite a boost in sales. So you go to Amazon and buy it there, buy it anywhere. It's BLM, The Making of a New Marxist Revolution. Mike, by the way, thank you very much for this panel. It was very enjoyable for me.
This has been fantastic. Jonathan, your book, Splintered Critical Race Theory and the Progressive War on Truth, it's not out yet. When does that come out, and where can people look for that?
You can pre-order it today. It's also available on Amazon. It'll be released and shipped on March 22nd, but it's available for pre-order.
Well, thank you both for this fantastic conversation. For our guests who attended today, we'll be sharing an email with you where we'll give you a link to those books so you can go out and purchase them. This is a really important issue to the Goldwater Institute. We're focusing on ensuring that academic transparency is passed in states nationwide. We want to make sure that parents' rights to know what's being taught in the classroom is protected. And then we're also exposing critical race theory for what it is. You can support our mission at goldwaterinstitute.org. And please stay tuned for future events just like this one, both streaming online and in person. And thank you, gentlemen. Again, this has been a great presentation. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.